Serra Angel, one of the most iconic Magic cards of all time. She's as old as the game of Magic itself, making her debut in 1993's limited edition Alpha. For 3 generic and 2 white, you get a 4/4 with flying and vigilance. This French vanilla creature isn't that impressive by today's standards, as creatures have gotten progressively more powerful over the last 31 years, but Serra Angel was once considered the best creature in the entire game. But it's been a very long time since those days, so there are many players who don't know just how impressive this angel was in Magic's earliest days. So, that begs the question, how good was Serra Angel, actually? Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and this is the pilot episode of a new series I'm trying out, one that might replace one of my MTG top 10s each week if it does well. In it, I'll be taking a deep dive into a single card and discussing its competitive history. As you probably know, I initially got the idea for this format from False Swipe Gaming's videos that look at the history of competitive Pokemon. I plan on running polls to let viewers decide on the topic of these videos, and this time around, Serra Angel soundly defeated Urnamjin, so let's answer the question that so many of you want to know. How good was Serra Angel actually? Creatures in Magic's earliest days were significantly weaker than they are today. It's inarguable that power creep is a thing when it comes to creatures, although I would say that people overuse the term these days. That's because it isn't really universal to all the game's card types. After all, the game's earliest artifacts, instants, sorceries, and enchantments were pretty broken, but I'll get on that soapbox in another video sometime. Anyway, in Alpha there were 4 creatures that stood above all the rest in terms of their efficiency and imposing board presence. These were Mahamoti-Jin, Shivan Dragon, Sengir Vampire, and Serra Angel. All 4 of them sport flying, which made them very difficult to block, and they all have different strengths. Mahamoti-Jin is the largest of the group, Shivan Dragon can threaten the greatest damage output, and Sengir Vampire gets buffed when creatures it damages are killed. While these all won tons of games in Magic's earliest days, it's Serra Angel that came out on top, and it isn't even close. She's not as big as Mahamoti-Jin or Shivan Dragon, and she doesn't have an inherent way to increase her stats like the Vampire, so what made her better than that trio of flyers? Well, we can answer that question in one word: vigilance. Well, I should say that we can answer it with one word today, because back then vigilance was about a decade away from being keyworded, so if we were to answer that question in 1993, we would have to use a whole sentence. She doesn't tap when she attacks. Serra Angel was the only card in limited edition Alpha, Beta, and Unlimited who had this ability. That might sound like a small thing. I mean, vigilance is hardly a keyword that we get excited about in 2024, right? But it was a huge deal, especially when combined with an efficient flying body. Serra Angel could attack right over your opponent's creatures and end the game in 5 turns, and she could do it without giving up anything on defense. Her big body could effectively block most of the creatures in the game too. Officially sanctioned competitive Magic was born in 1994 with the announcement of the first World Championship. It was at that point that the deck building rules were standardized to what we know them as today. A 60 card minimum, and you could run no more than 4 of the same card apart from basic lands. Before these restrictions were put in place, Magic was almost entirely dominated by combo decks as they were insanely consistent without these restrictions. However, once these restrictions were established and Magic's early combo degeneracy was largely brought under control, Serra Angel emerged as one of the best cards in the game. There were a full 4 copies of Serra Angel in Zach Dolan's deck that won Magic's very first World Championship. Of all the decks to finish in the top 4 at the event, Zach's was the closest to what we would call a traditional control deck today. The others were lowered to the ground, looking to run out a Curd Ape on turn 1. Meanwhile, Zach's whole game plan was to completely grind the game to a screeching halt, using removal like Swords to Plowshares, and then win the game with the almighty Serra Angel, who could block those decks' smaller creatures while inflicting a ton of damage in a hurry. One of the genius things about the deck was how well it could leverage Serra Angel's unique ability: vigilance. It worked particularly well with 2 of the deck's prison effects, Meekstone and Stasis. Meekstone would lock down any creature that might actually be large enough to attack through Serra Angel, like Shivan Dragon and friends, but didn't affect her at all since she never got tapped. And Stasis meant most creatures wouldn't be untapping, but because the angel never tapped in the first place, she could just keep going after your opponent. Zach's strategy proved to be a sound one against the more aggressive decks that otherwise dominated the event, and it would mark the beginning of Serra Angel's dominance in competitive Magic, something that would continue through 1995 and 1996. 1996 was probably the best year in the history of Serra Angel. That year, she was one of the most important cards in Standard. The Angel achieved 2 Pro Tour top 8s, 1 World Championship win, and 5 top 8s at Nationals. That might not sound completely insane by today's standards, as we just have so many more events in a year, but at the time, that effectively meant she was making some noise at every major competitive event in 1996. She continued to see play in control decks, but she found her way into other types of decks too. She was so good that she even made her way into decks that were built around the creature she beat out in the poll that determined the topic of this video. That's right, she showed up alongside Erhnam Djinn in Erhnam-Geddon decks. These decks took a bit of a different route from the control decks of 1994 and 1995, as they were significantly more aggressive. Instead of gaining control of the game slowly, these decks looked to get ahead on the board and then cast Armageddon. At that point, your Angel or Djinn could quickly close out the game against a defenseless opponent. Erhnam Djinn was a better creature for the deck, since you could get it down a turn earlier, and thus you could cast Armageddon more quickly, but Serra Angel was a pretty darn good plan B. She didn't only see play in control decks and in aggro decks as second fiddle to Erhnam in 1996 though. She was also part of the game's earliest white weenie decks, including the one that won the 1996 World Championship. These are aggressive mono-white decks that look to curve out with cheap creatures and overwhelm the opponent. While Serra Angel is a bit too costly for today's white weenie decks at 5 mana, she was a great top curve in the slower aggro decks of the time. If you couldn't win with your initial burst of Savannah Lions and White Knights, she could certainly finish the job. Standard wasn't the only format where she was important in 1996 either. She was also featured in one of the most important decks in the history of Magic, one simply called The Deck. In 1995, Magic gained separate formats for the first time. The game was divided into Type 1 and Type 2, which were the precursors to Vintage and Standard, respectively. In other words, Type 1 had access to pretty much all the cards that had been printed, including singleton copies of super busted cards like the Power 9. Brian Weissman's The Deck was the dominant Type 1 deck of 1996. It's an important deck in the game's history because it's really the first time someone really constructed a deck with the same principles as the control decks of today. We saw that control-ish decks existed as early as 1994, but you may have noticed there were 2 components really missing from Zach Dolan's deck: counter magic and card draw, 2 things that are essential in the control decks of today. The deck was when this mindset changed. Weissman's deck was all about trading 1-for-1 using removal spells and counter magic like Mana Drain, and then drawing extra cards with Brain Geyser and Jayemdae Tome. Once the game had ground to a screeching halt and you had card advantage, the deck would, of course, win by slamming a Serra Angel on the board. This deck isn't as heavy on prison-type effects as the earlier decks we've looked at, but it does still pack a couple of copies of Moat, which goes great with the Angel. Much like with Stasis and Meekstone, it locks most creatures out of the game, but not her. So between 1994 and 1996, Serra Angel dominated Standard. And in 1996, she was also winning tons of games in Vintage. At this point, she was riding pretty high. So high that when they printed the 5th edition core set in 1997 and the 6th edition core set in 1999, they elected not to reprint her as they considered her too good. And given what we've discussed in this video, you can see why they would think that. She was seeing tons of play in Standard, and she was even the best creature in Magic's most powerful format, Vintage. So you can't really fault their decision at the time. It certainly made Standard more interesting to remove the format's best creature. But by the time Serra Angel did finally receive a Standard legal reprint in 2001's 7th edition, the game had changed significantly. In 2000, Wizards of the Coast began to consciously push creatures, as they wanted more games to be determined by attacking and blocking, and less to be determined by crazy spell-based combos which had dominated the game in the late 1990s. So when Serra Angel first saw the light of day again, she was walking into a Standard that had Blastoderm and Flametongue Kavu, 2 creatures that cost 1 mana less than her and could just laugh at her 5 mana 4/4 flying stat line, Vigilance be damned. Blastoderm could attack right through her while avoiding removal, and Flametongue Kavu could kill her when he entered the battlefield and start smashing in for 4, and now if you wanted to spend 5 mana, you could get something like Spiritmonger, a 5 mana 6/6 with upside. Serra Angel was officially no longer the best creature in the game. Now, she didn't go completely unplayed in the Standard of 2001. While she didn't put up any Pro Tour or World's top 8s, she did appear in decks that top 8'd regional events, including at German Nationals and the Asia Pacific Championship. This would be her last hurrah as a Standard viable card, and she got to go out seeing play in the 2 types of decks she was played in during her heyday. Steven Valkaiser top-8'd German nationals with a Zoo aggro deck that sported a couple of angels. And Peter Chow top-8'd the Asian Pacific Championship with a blue-white control deck that featured Serra Angel and Mahamoti Jin as the main win conditions. This was her last gasp in Standard though, as she has never top-8'd another Standard event since 2001, and this time it isn't because she wasn't reprinted. Now that it was clear she wasn't going to disrupt Standard significantly, she started to receive reprints with regularity, as she was one of the game's most iconic cards, and including her in core sets was fun for many players. She would get reprints in 8th edition, 9th edition, and 10th edition at rare. By Magic 2010, she had her rarity downshifted to uncommon, further indicating how far she had fallen. She's remained at uncommon in all subsequent reprints, with the most recent Standard legal reprint coming in 2018's Dominaria. To see play these days, a creature needs to be really cheap and or efficient and or give you value when it enters a battlefield or dies, or be difficult to remove. Serra Angel just doesn't check any of those boxes. For comparison's sake, let's look at the 5-mana angels that have dominated Standard during the game's more recent history over the last few years, like Archangel Avacyn, Baneslayer Angel, and Lyra Dawnbringer. You can see these cards blow Serra Angel out of the water. So yeah, Serra Angel just isn't good enough for Magic's 60-card formats anymore. However, there is one place where Serra Angel still performs quite well: Limited. As I said a moment ago, her most recent Standard legal reprint came in 2018's Dominaria. This is considered by most, including me, to be one of the best limited formats of all time, and as a result it shows up on Flashback Draft on Magic Arena all the time. This is good news, because that means even though it's a set from Magic's earliest days, we have some data for it on 17 lands. 17lands.com is a great website if you're a limited player, as it compiles data about limited formats on Magic Arena, giving us some idea about how well cards perform in a given limited format. So, we know that Serra Angel has put up an impressive 58.9% win rate in Dominaria Limited. This gives her the 40th highest win rate in the set, the 15th highest win rate among uncommons, and the 8th highest win rate among all white cards. So in Limited, she's still good for the same reason she used to be good in 60-card formats. Her stats and keywords are still good value for the cost there, she can end the game quickly in the air, and she's not that easy to attack through either. She's worth taking with a pretty high pick if you play Dominaria Limited. Granted, she was a stone cold bomb and an easy first pick when she got printed in older core sets. We don't have data for those days, but it sure feels like she had a win rate above 70% when she got reprinted in core sets over the years, so power creep applies to Limited too, it's just a lot less pronounced. So let's answer the opening question. How good was Serra Angel actually? Well, between 1994 and 1996, she was one of the best cards in the game, and at least when it came to win conditions, she was the best creature around. She was so good that she didn't get reprinted in a Standard legal set for several years, and by the time she was, creatures had gradually become more powerful, and she no longer stood head and shoulders above the rest. There were lots of cheaper creatures that now had her number. She saw only a little bit of play in 2001, and ever since then she hasn't seen play in Magic's 60-card formats, but she is still pretty good in Limited. So that's the competitive history of one of Magic's most iconic cards, Serra Angel. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it, leave a comment, and if you're a new viewer, subscribe. This is a new series, and I need to know how you're feeling about it to decide whether or not I'll continue. If you want to have a say in what card I look at in the next episode of this series, head over to the Community tab and vote in the newest poll. If you'd like to get your hands on Serra Angel, or any other card that made an appearance in this video, use my Card Kingdom link in the description and check out their store. Thanks for watching.